Very lucky to be chatting to a long-time friend of mine, a guy who's been a very major player in our local music industry for decades, Mr. Greg Dodge. How are you, Dodgy?
Mate, Nick, I'm really well, mate. Really well, thank you.
Mate, before we get into the music and what you're doing, just this little show I'm doing, I'm calling it Aussie Local and Live, and trying to capture local stories. Now, this morning, I was waiting for you to come online because you'd been out doing a co-op you do with veggies. Is that right?
Yeah, we do a fruit and veggie co-op down at the Redcliffe Peninsula. We're at Newport, a
Yeah.
new estate.
Yep.
And we started it about 3 or 4 years ago because we couldn't find good fruit and veg through COVID, and the supermarkets the food wouldn't last. It'd last a day and it'd go off.
Yep.
So we drive all the way to Rockley Markets. We bought a ticket to buy wholesale, where all the shops and all the fruities buy it. We get a group of people from around the neighbourhood, and that takes a bit of, marketing and getting them. We've got about 40 in the group, but we get between 10 and 20, and we all share the fruit and veggies that we buy. So, yeah, it's just something very different.
I know obviously you get the quality of the food and all that stuff. Economically, does it work out better?
Oh,
about the same as the shop?
economically. One of the girls took photos, then went online and compared it against Coles and Woolies, and we were 50% cheaper and 100% fresher. Awesome. Our stuff lasts 3 weeks. Most of it just lasts. It's just bizarre.
So I know you've got your area and your people you do there, but if people in another area want a bit of advice on how to do that, can they email you about it? I'll just get some idea on how it's done.
Yeah, sure. They can email me, Universal Greg.
Up there, mate. I'll put that on there for you.
Yeah, universalgreg42@gmail.com. I don't mind answering that fruit and veggie questions because, we'd been working with the Goodwill Projects, which is they run all the farmers markets around Brisbane, probably about 8 of them, the one in the city, Redcliffe at Castledine. And we talked to a lot of the Vietnamese there. And because I said, do you grow all this stuff? And they said, no. We get it from Rockley. And a lot of it, they do grow some of the bok choy and stuff. But I tell you what, it's not easy, though, even to get just for a group of 10 or 15, 20 people, because you end up with about 24 varieties.
Yep.
So you end up with about 10 fruit, 10 veggies. But when you buy a box of apples, with 80 to 90 apples in one box and you split it up, you're all getting a good feed.
Yeah. No, that's great. You do that weekly or?
No, we do it. We tried it weekly. It was just too much. Then we tried fortnightly. We do it every 3 weeks because the stuff lasts.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Mate, very, very cool. And I think, that's one thing we learned going through that whole COVID thing was we've got to look locally more and more. We've got to be sort of getting the things that we want sustainable in our own backyard as much as we can,
It's hard. All of it is Australian produce, but some of it, of course, comes up from Victoria or Adelaide or, from other New South Wales, etc. But you know what? That's the whole thing. In this country, we grow so much great food, and there's a lot of local farmers. We were buying some stuff off the guys up at Sanford.
Yep.
But every now and again, they could go because they can't keep growing at 12 months of the year. Yeah. They have moments where it's great, and then there are moments when it's just not so great.
But even working together as a local community and having, being able to cut out in those situations, so many in the food chain, pun on words, but there's so many people, those big chains that, from the cost of the building and the rent to the staff, and sure, most people are going to buy from that, and they're always going to keep making their hundreds of millions of dollars.
Oh yeah,
but
totally. Yeah, I agree. But anyway, that's fruit and veggie.
That's cool. Very different. Very, very good. Now, mate, you've had a long history in the music industry, of course, here locally. You were a bass player originally, correct?
Well, I was a bass player from Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania,
Okay.
And then I came up in 1978 with that band on the circuit, on the Ivan Damon circuit, which then was taken over by Graham Hutchinson because Ivan had passed away. But I was, just a bass player in a 3-piece. And we travelled Queensland.
So did Graham work for Ivan?
I believe so, because he sort of inherited it. That's what I remember. And I think Ivan had the West Point Casino in Hobart, and we had a 6 months residency there, which really, I suppose, it was a 6-hour gig. We'd start at 9 and finish at 3. Is that 6 hours? But anyway, it was a long gig.
Yeah.
But we lived upstairs with all the dancers, the Mercy Bucco dancers, you know. Not bad with
Tough
you.
break, mate.
17, 18, right?
Yeah, yeah,
No, someone had to do it.
yeah.
And that was a great intro, you know, to life and touring. Came up to Queensland. I mean, I was in some original groups, you know, in Tassie. There was a lot of original music there, a
Yep,
big music scene, as you can imagine, because Tasmanians live indoors beside the fire, you know,
yep.
at least 8 months of the year. And so, you know, a lot of the pubs and clubs have fires in them, you know, open fires back in the day. And I used to work in a music store. In 1975, I joined Alan's Music in Hobart, of all things.
Wow.
That's how far I go back. But when
Yeah.
I met my girl, which I'm still married to, in
Lost you there, mate. Don't know what
yeah,
happened.
I don't know what happened there.
No. So
Um,
when you lost your girl, go from there.
yeah, I met my current wife up in Townsville, and she was from Brisbane, Jules, and she was visiting her sister in Townsville, and I was in the band, and I met her. But the weirdest part is she came back to Brisbane to be with her boyfriend, and I just never thought much about it, except I fell in love.
Yep.
The band broke up, and I came back to Brisbane, and Mal Barnes sent me back up to Mount Isa to play in a band with Greg Shaw.
Mhm.
That's how I met Shorey, you know. He was
Yep.
guitarist in this band. Um, and so, you know, we're really good friends today. We work together on a lot of projects and, you know, driving projects, particularly with tours and stuff. Um, but yeah, and then I went back to Tasmania in 1980. I came back to Brisbane, you know, married, or married up here in 1980. And I ended up playing in a band for a couple of years, but I had to get a real job. Yeah, not saying I had to, but you know, I thought, oh, I better get responsible. You know, I was about 22 by then, 21, 22. And I ended up joining Kmart,
Okay.
sadly. But I did that for 4 years and I threw myself into it, even though I was playing in bands.
Mm.
But I basically got my business training from them. It was like joining the army.
Yeah.
Not that I wanted to be in the army, but I didn't want to be in Kmart either. So I became
Sure.
an area manager and then quit and came and worked at Parling's Music in Brisbane in 1984.
Mate, for people who don't know, just go back over a couple of things there. You're saying that you're on the circuit with Ivan, which became Graham Hutchison's circuit. And what used to happen back in those days was we'd be in our bands and we'd get sent to like Bundaberg, Rockhampton, Gladstone, Townsville. You'd do these runs where you'd be in, I don't know if it was the same for Ivan, but with Graham, you'd be in that place for a week or two.
Yeah.
And you
Oh,
play
3 weeks. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, we did 3 week runs.
and you
And you
play.
live in the house. You live
Yeah,
in the house together with all these other bands that are coming through.
that's it.
Big houses, big old Queenslanders.
Yeah, and you might be, and like back in those days, a lot of the rooms were big rooms, and you'd be playing to 1,000,
Yeah.
1,500 people on the weekend. It's
Yeah.
reasonable not during the week, and while you were there at the residency, well, Dragon might come through or In Excess or whatever, and you'd have to
Yep.
pull your PA down, and their PA would go up, but you'd be the support act for that, and you get to hang out with the band and the road crew, and you get to learn your ropes. And was, to me, I think it was one of the most important things we ever had up here for creating a good grassroots industry at that time, because you're playing so much, you just got to be really. There were so many good bands back then.
Oh,
So you had that,
man.
and then Greg mentioned he met Greg Shaw, and Shaw was ended up becoming one of the major agents and managers around our state, and of course, very famously was the guy who got Keith Urban going and got Keith in the States and happening over there, and a very much loved guy, Shawry. And then you became you got into retail after that, mate, and you learnt your skills at Kmart. I imagine that you would have got your head around how systems work and everything there really well.
Yeah, you were freezing on me there.
Oh, well, okay. Internet must be playing up today for some reason.
Yeah, yeah, you were freezing, but that's okay. It's all good. It's all good.
So, mate, you your retail maybe start where your music retail started. When did that kick off?
Yeah, so obviously I in the late 70s in Tassie, mid 70s, I joined Alan's Music and then I went to another music store down there and you know, knowing all the musicians as a young fella, you know,
Yeah.
they were 10 years older, 15 years older, 20 years older. And I'd go out and watch them 6 nights a week, 7 nights a week. And even as a band, as you know, you wouldn't just do one gig a night. You might say 6 nights a week. You do 3 gigs that night.
Yeah, yeah.
So I mean, I experienced all that, and we just lived for that moment.
Yep.
But of course, when I came to Brisbane, the biggest thing I noticed in '84, I'm talking about 1984, I joined Parling's Music after I'd had the experience with Kmart, and Kmart had transferred me up to Townsville. I lived up there for about a year and a half. But we had our young daughter, our oldest daughter now, obviously our first daughter in 1983. And we wanted to come back to Brisbane and came back, and I quit Kmart and joined Parlings. And I took an enormous pay drop because, even working as an area manager, you're on reasonably good money at a young age.
Yep.
I joined Parlings in the city. They had a store down there near, sort of down on the end near Edward Street. And they used to sell records and pianos and a lot of sheet music. And I was in the musical instrument area with saxophones and drums and guitar. And it wasn't a very cool rock shop, by the way.
Mm.
It was not the hippest shop in the town.
They supplied the schools and things like that, didn't they?
Well, yeah, they were, but they weren't. I mean, the Australian Academy of Music at the time, run by Johnny Morris, bless him, great guy. Johnny had that shop. There were probably 7 or 8 music stores at the time when I was at Parlings, Musicians Pro Shop, and there was up at Red Hill. There were Fords over at Wollongabba.
Mm-hmm.
There were quite a few. But what happened at Parlings, over the next 2 years, we got to move from that Queen Street Mall and we moved over to Elizabeth Street, and they put the musical instruments downstairs. And it enabled us to get accounts like Fender and more serious brands. And we started moving into electronic, as in electronic synthesizers and DX7s and so on. So by 1986, it became a rock shop. And I think I was sort of driving that. I'm a young guy with business management experience, running a retail store that I passionately loved. And we do things like band competitions and people like Costa Zulio, who ended up working for ABC for 35 years. He was with 3 Hours of Power on Triple J and then Double J. And I just really connected up with him again last year because he said, Dodgy, you've retired, haven't you? I said, no. Technically, no. Theoretically, yeah. But he said he's about to retire and he wants to do stuff. And I said, you should start a podcast. So that's a whole nother story. We'd come back because I've had him interview my artist, which I'll talk about later, and on his own podcast. Oh, yeah, but I met all these bands and stuff in 1986, and I started building a strong support network, and then I went and left there in 1987 because Brashes came up from Melbourne to buy Parlings.
Yep.
And I didn't want to work for corporate again. That was me. I had my taste at Kmart, and I went up to work at Music Junction in 87. I think it was 87, 88, when Cliffy Chandler and Paul Smith and all these guys, Alan Walker, up in Paddington, which is where you were mentioning John Davis. He ended up working there in the guitar shop, as it's known today, at Latrobe Terrace. So I went there to manage it for 18 months and eventually got what I call the entrepreneurial seizure.
Yep.
Which is I wanted to start my own music store. And by hook or by crook, with no money, I started a shop with a partner, a guy called Nigel Line, and we started a store in 1989 called Music Works, WORX. Yeah.
Exactly. Became legendary around town, mate. Certainly did. And mate, during that time too, I might come back to this, but I know you were a founder of Q Music that sort of started up there, or from Oz Music. But come back to that. But mate, as you said, you're not working directly these days. You're certainly haven't put your feet up, and you've stepped into the artist management role.
Yeah, I've always, even back when I had the music store, the music store had a 6-year life. Music Works was such a passion for us because it was the culmination of working for other people and then being able to do something uniquely ours, And I'm a self-taught, which I'm an autodidact, which just means self-taught, but it sounds better. And I created my own marketing database. We didn't have a computer, but we had exercise books, and we ended up with 3,000 on our mailing list.
Yeah.
at Music Works. And we have, as you know, 3 quarterly newsletters that we used to produce.
Yep.
Again, not having a single computer in our traps, we'd outsource it and we'd create it, and we'd have workshops every 2 weeks in the store. And at that time, I was involved in a new body that Johnny Morris, that I mentioned from Academy, had partnered with Barry Bull. Well, actually, I'll go back even a step further because a lot of people don't know this history. I was managing Music Junction before I stepped into Music Works, and we went to a trade show down in Sydney. And the trade show was run by Yamaha, Fender, Roland, Electric Factory, which was one of the suppliers, Pro Music. There were about 36 different importers of musical instruments and PA systems and drums. And they suggested that retailers should join their traders association. So they had a thing called the AMTA, the Australian Music Traders Association. And they used to run shows to sell to the retailers. But what they wanted to do was get the retailers to join. And then they would, every 2 years, they would have a retailer as the head of that. And then the next 2 years, they would have a wholesaler. That was the plan.
Right.
But I came back from that show and I rang up Johnny Morris, who was like, geez, 20, 25 years older than me, maybe older again. John had been in the town for a long time. He'd started Academy probably in the early 70s. And I said to John, we should start a retail association in Queensland. But I said, we need more than just retailers. We need recording studios and we need other bodies, musicians. We need a whole bunch of people. So we ended up getting Yamaha guy to fly up. He was the head of the AMTA at the time, and he said, hey, we like the fact you're thinking about having your own body. To cut a long story short, we had our first meeting at the City Hall, and along came Barry Bull, and along came a few other business owners, and we put this idea about forming this thing called the Music Industry Association of Queensland. And I think it was through the cooperation of Johnny Morris as the president, Barry became the secretary, Mick Privatera the treasury, and I became the workshop coordinator. Because I hadn't yet started my music store. I was working at Music Junction, but one of the things I was really good at was putting on workshops. I had Michael Jackson's guitarist in the Parlings, and when I went to Music Junction, we put on a lot of workshops. We did a lot of workshops at Parlings and at Music Junction. And I said to these guys, we should get record companies up, we should get them to present. So we did a couple of big shows in 88, 89. And I think 89 is when I started Music Works. So that's when I told Barry, John, and Mick that I'm going to start my own business. And Mick wasn't happy because I ended up setting up 2 doors up the road from him. But, look, at the end of the day, that's business, right?
Yep.
But the MIQ lasted a couple of years until it made a bad decision, but it made some good ones too. One was to create a book called The Young Player's Guide to the Music Industry. And what it changed the focus away from, like you were talking about, this was a covers scene. There were people playing covers bands, but I was pretty well attracted to and wanted more original bands to exist. So I would support original bands. And even as far back as 1986, the Australian Academy of Music used to run a thing called the Australian Academy of Music Rock Awards.
Yep.
And it was a huge thing. It had been going since the late 70s. And it was a really good marketing promotion for them at Academy, but it was only for cover bands, really, predominantly. If you were an original band, you were almost like poo-pah'd. So at Parlings, we did a band competition in about 86, 87. And I said, if you're an originals band, you actually get double points. and the point was, original bands will win. You know what I mean? And it was a bit... Our first band that won one of the competitions, I remember, was the Newsboys from the Sunshine Coast, and a band called... no, it doesn't matter, it's gone. But they were a sort of electronic band.
Right.
and they were quite big. Both of them became quite reasonably big. Newsboys went massive
Huge
over.
in the church and Christian scene. They became major.
Yeah, yeah, but they were much like the early punk type bands, but they just happened to be a Christian flavour, which a lot of Christian bands became. Remember, they were very rock and very punk. So that was 86, 87. Academy that next year had an original category.
Right.
So I think that was just influencing the change.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on, as you know. I mean, not just in our world. There was Triple Z was doing a lot of underground stuff, which was more heavy and alternate stuff. But in a way, there was not a real creativity was not a thing at the front of everyone's minds. I had one of my customers come in who was a teacher, and he said to me that he wanted to start a college through TAFE, teaching people about songwriting and about production and about management and artist management. Now, the Brisbane in that period in 88, 89 was not part of the Australian record industry. You know, there were a few exceptions, but they were very rare.
Yep.
You know, many bands were told to get out of Brisbane if you wanted to make it. Get out.
We were told
There's
that
nothing
you had to come from Sydney or Melbourne, and that really, when State of Origin kicked in, that had a bit of why so many musicians are so passionate about it, because we had to go away from Brisbane.
Well, that's the thing, and a lot of these bands like the Go-Betweens, and I'll just pause it there, Nick.
Mm-hmm.
1 sec. My battery. Hang on.
You're right, mate.
Why are you not working? It's not working. It's not charging, and I'm scared because it's down to 10%, and it was working before. Now it's playing up on me. Hang on. Bear with me.
You're right, mate.
At least you can cut that out.
Yep, sure. No, this is why I pre-recorded it, mate. It just makes it easier.
Yeah, good. Okay, now I'm back. So bands like the Go-Betweens and other bands around the time, like the Saints, obviously in the 70s, bands would leave and really they'd never called Brisbane home. But at that period in 89, I met a guitarist called Ian Hogue, and Hoagie was in a band that evolved into Powderfinger. And when I had Music Works, they became one of our clients at the time. They were managed by one of their schoolmates, a guy called Paul Patico, and that band was an original band. Now, by the way, they were a cover band originally. Yeah. And, there's many stories about them, doing Neil Young covers and all the rest.
Yeah, being in the rock and not getting through, and they tell
that's it. They didn't get through the Rock Awards and yada yada. But what was interesting is there was a scene that was emerging. There was a younger scene. It was younger than me too. Like, these are guys in their 20s. I was in my 30s by then, early 30s. In Brisbane, in the Targa building in the Valley, they started rehearsing there, a whole lot of bands. It became a sort of a band haven, and you had Pro Shop had a rehearsal room upstairs, and Music Works down in Bruce Fogarty's area called Roadworks, he had rehearsal rooms. And so you had this buzz of people just rehearsing, and music and new stuff was coming, and that was about 92, 93. So behind the scenes, MIAQ fell apart, and that's another whole story. And for no one's reason, Barry went off to develop the Australian Music Record Association for AMRA, I think it was called, for record stores.
Yep.
Which was a good one. Johnny Morris went off to be the president of the AMTA, which became the AMA, Australian Music Association. And Greg Dodge was left holding this MIAQ with the debt. Because I mentioned we created a book called The Young Player's Guide to the Music Business.
Yep.
In their wisdom, they decided to print off 10,000 copies. And I kept saying, I think you're only going to sell 1,000. No, Barry had been an industry gentleman that knew the industry. He said, we could easily sell them. Come on, Greg, very ambitious. But they left MIAQ in a little bit of a debt, and MIAQ couldn't recover from that. So we walked away from it and set up a new body, which we called Q Music Inc., but the idea of Q Music wasn't controlled by retailers.
Yep.
That was the goal. Not that the MIQ had 4 music retailers, including me, but we had people like Murray Wern from, with John Bossack, had been in studios, and
Yep.
they'd worked with the Queensland Recording Association, which had the Sunnies back then. Remember the early awards that they had?
Yep.
But Q Music was a new baby that we didn't even know what we're giving birth to, but we knew we needed something. So by 93, we'd started that. But at the same time, in 92, from that gentleman that I'd met in the store back in 88, 89, his name was Robert Brock. He was a teacher. We ended up setting up the South Bank Rock School, or it was originally called COTAR.
Mm-hmm. Hey, quick commercial break. Big shout out to our sponsor for today's episode, which is me, Nick Phillips. Look, I've got to thank myself so much. I couldn't be doing the show without me. And if you get a chance, check out the sponsor's website, www.nickphillips.com. Check out my music, my videos, my bio, all that stuff, and maybe contact me and book me for a gig. That would be great. But thanks, Nick, for your sponsorship. Back to the show.
And COTAR means catering and tourism and hospitality, because that's where the government
spend
thought
money.
Music was at.
Yeah,
they thought that artists would be built to play in cafes and restaurants and on trains. They didn't understand there was no and very little conversation around intellectual property and building the recorded side of the industry, because there were no real solid record companies here. There were no publishers here. There were no management companies here. And that's 92. But underneath it, there were things like Livid, the Livid Festival, which was the alternative sort of ideas, and bands like Regurgitator and Powderfinger and all these other ones in those early days. There was a scene erupting, and I think Q Music was born out of that time. But by 95, my business had gone broke. So I walked away from what we started because I couldn't afford to participate. I mean, there was no income from that. You're generating an idea, but it's purely in its early infancy days.
Yep. Yeah, we lost I think we missed a big opportunity back at that time to actually be putting together platforms that were encouraging like publishing companies to come here, or encouraging those commercial elements to come here, because really we're still way behind the game in that regards now. Of course we have more management companies, we have more good education things up here, but as far as the actual industry, record companies and publishing companies, we're very far behind where we need to be.
So Melbourne had its Mushroom Records and a whole host of independent labels and promoters, and Sydney had the major record companies, the Warner Chappells, and they were signing people. Sony was signing people, and Polygram, which became Universal. And Brisbane didn't have any of that infrastructure, or Queensland in total. The people that broke away and were getting signed in those early 90s were, Troy Casadali gets a thing, Graham O'Connor, country music, and a lot of country artists. There was Tony O'Connor. Remember, Tony O'Connor had an incredible instrumental thing going on. He made his first million, I think, in 1990. But there were no infrastructure, nothing, and that wasn't from a lack of trying, So Greg Shaw had set up Sure Thing Agency, which was taken over by Darren Clark and Frank Monteverdi.
Yep.
And they were effectively, still caught between doing covers and original artists. They were probably trying to do both at the time.
A lot of my friends who were doing the circuit and doing a lot of cover work, a lot of them were original players as well. We're all writing our stuff. We're all working on our album, but we weren't working at retail stores or doing other things. We were making our living by going out and playing gigs. And we were always battling uphill because we didn't have those platforms up here to work with us on the original stuff we were trying to do.
No, and there were great artists. Neil Coombe had a band called Fear of Falling, and he'd come out of bands like Misdemeanor and Dealer. That was a whole scene that was around when I first came in the 80s, you know. And he'd had a band by 1989 that got signed to a compilation album out of Sydney, which was unique. But for it to set up was Chris Murphy, you know, management of In Excess, and Sebastian Chase, who at the time I think was managing Dragon.
Yeah.
You know, he'd managed Cold Chisel and Rose Tattoo in the earlier days. But Sebastian set up this compilation album called Ruart Records. And Ruart would take good artists out of Sydney and some out of Melbourne and Sydney. And, you know, bands like Screaming Jets came out of that. You know, Jenny Morris came out of that. Rat
Well, he
Cat.
took In Excess into America, didn't he? Seb?
Pardon?
Seb took In Excess into America, didn't he?
No, I think that was Chris.
Oh, okay.
Chris Murphy. Yeah, Chris Murphy took In Excess into America. Yep.
Right.
And Chris did very well. He was their manager. But Sab and he had a falling out, I think, at that time. And I don't know the detail, but they both went their separate ways and it imploded. But the idea was great. From what I gather, Ruart Records, around that time in the late 80s, early 90s, was about discovering new emerging artists.
Yeah.
You know, the Clouds. I mean, there's so many that came out of that period. And that's the type of energy you need. Out of Brisbane, there was an energy, but by 95, working particularly in that scene, I had walked away from it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I had a young family and I had to survive, and I went into mobile phones for a blink of an eye. And then I came back in wholesale music with Australis, you know, visiting music stores rather than being involved in the live scene. And then I ended up at Eloise Music in 1999 out at Kedron, a very much an old mum and dad's piano store.
Mm-hmm.
But I could see a challenge. I love challenges, right? I mean, Q Music was well on its way to not understanding even what it wanted to be. Like our whole idea and premise from the beginning was to think global, but act local. So really support artists to see the bigger world, see the bigger picture. And we would teach them about things like intellectual property and copyright and publishing and, you know, how you own your masters and don't get sold to the major record companies, because sometimes that's just not the only way.
Yeah.
You know, so we were talking a lot of that indie stuff up, but just be professional about it. And one person I think who gained, there's a couple, Paul Curtis gained from that, Paul Petico gained from that. Paul Petico went on to set up Secret Sounds after the success of Powderfinger, you know, and to be fair, they had 21 years as a band up until they decided to call it a day in 2010.
Yep.
And that had set a few of them up, Ian, with his studio, Airlock, up in, you know, the mountains. JC forming a partnership and setting up Trifford down in Newstead, and then eventually Fortitude Valley Music Hall. And the drummer, John Coggle, I think, was up the Sunshine Coast doing very active. So, and Bernard took off overseas and, you know, don't know what.
Kept making great music, yeah.
Yeah, making music, continued to write.
And Darren's been doing some great stuff too. I've seen Darren's been.
Oh, of course, yes.
His
Darren,
of his last album he did acoustic work, but he's been doing a thing to attribute to the Pink Floyd stuff too, I think recently. Yeah.
Apparently his show is very, very good, and I haven't seen it, but I've heard about it. I think the good thing is that little scene didn't run off and just disperse. They all reinvested in the town, and I mean, Due Process Records, which John Mullins, who was a bass player originally, John has been there for 30 years. He was a journalist originally at Due Process, owned by Paul Petico, Secret Sounds. And they've been signing artists from all over the world, you know, and that's a label in Brisbane. So to be fair, they're one of a few. There's a few little ones like, well, they're not little anymore. You know, they've been quite a force.
Yeah, but we need more of those things developing. But having seen what we all went through back then and what the industry was like and how it was set up, now you step back into the game managing an artist. What are you seeing the differences are from that perspective? Because even though you weren't managing someone back then specifically, you were seeing all those aspects of the industry. But what are you seeing the changes are now?
So the fundamentals still remain the same. You know, like the fundamentals of an artist creating a body of works, gigging to keep alive and keeping and building their audience, the distribution of the end product, which obviously is from physical to digital, is probably the most painful thing that artists have got to put up with today, because yes, you've got all the world as your audience, but the competition is, the reality is there's 130,000 new songs or more per day being released globally. 130,000. It's probably 180,000, let's say, because I heard this 5 years ago. So, and then you've probably got another 100,000 a day coming out now in AI, where other people are just amateurly pulling stuff together and throwing it up on the platforms.
Yeah.
So the industry is very different in a digital phase, but the mechanics of what you do still remain the same. The process of an artist has still got to write good songs. Like, a good song still does sit at the heart of it. But in saying that, a lot of great songs have been written, and you know this yourself from being a songwriter, and the fact that you've written some great songs doesn't actually mean that they go global just because you've written a great song. Now, I'll give you an example of when you start thinking global, and I know you've had experiences in America and China. When I'm driving, as I do at the moment, as a side hustle for some of the major promoters, and we'll have a production manager from America sitting beside me, and I'll say to him, I've just come off a 3-day event, the 50th anniversary of Cold Chisel. Have you heard of them? And the guy goes, no, don't know who you're talking about. And I go, yeah, they did 18,000 a night here in Brisbane for 3 shows. I said, it's pretty remarkable. And you haven't heard of them? He says, no. I said, oh, their singer, Jimmy Barnes. No. And I'm thinking, mind you, these guys are in their 40s, right? They're not 60s. And I said, isn't it incredible? Like, in Australia, you have your bands that you're aware of and you become very passionate about.
Yeah.
But externally to Australia, no one out there cares. And that's one of the hardest things for even Australian management or investment to get into, to try and build an audience here and then try to get your audience over there. I mean, all credit to those bands that used to hoik around America in those early days, and all credit to the AC/DCs in a different period and a different time that broke it in those countries. But we also know that it's not every band that you hear about and that are Aussie icons are majorly successful.
No,
They
I think it's also too, sometimes bands make the decision of how much, once they get to a certain point of success, how much do they want to go back to the bottom of the ladder in America or something to build their way up. I think that was probably a big thing for Cold Chisel, where they were big, obviously, in UK and parts of Europe and Australia and New Zealand, and they sort of end up, giving America the finger, I think, although Jimmy kept putting stuff out there. And I think the Powderfinger Boys too, I know some of their stuff in Europe, I don't think they kept pursuing it all the time because I think they were doing really well in their region down here. So that does sometimes get to the point saying, well, if you're really successful and you're making good money here and you're doing all that, well, why go back to playing to virtually nobody and beating the boards in an area that may or may not take off? So I understand that. But they also, it's the same around the world. Like, obviously, when I was doing my work in China, there are major, major stars in China that we never, ever hear of, obviously, because of the
correct.
But they're bigger than most American artists because of the size of the Mandarin-speaking population in the world. Same a lot of the Korean acts too. Same story. They did a lot of stuff in China. So there's all these pockets. But I think the main thing is there's always that, not fluke, but that you always got to be out. You got to be good. You've got to be out there swinging. But the chance of things going global or really big happens to a very, very small amount of artists, obviously, and generally because they need a major label behind them to sustain everything. But having said that, there's also a lot of ways these days for people to be looking locally and looking at how they make better income locally rather than trying to fight against that tsunami of 180 songs coming out every day. But within that's their own challenges as well. So I'm really keen to see, mate, with Jungaji, where you guys are heading as far as your marketing. Are you going local? Is it a global market? What's your target?
So
maybe just briefly to introduce the artist, if you could, make just for people.
Okay. So the artist Jungaji, also known as, or Aka, Troy Brady. So Troy Brady, I met him in 1993 out at Inala, which is a suburb in the western part of Brisbane. And he was in a singing group called Aim for More. There were 2 Torres Strait Islander boys and 2 Aboriginal boys. They had a manager, and he asked if I would come out and talk to them about writing songs, and a little bit about the industry. And the only reason he was asking me is I had a music store, and he thought as a businessman I could give them some business tips, you know. So I went out and met him, and he had a musical career as Troy Brady. He married a beautiful Zimbabwean lady called Trevelyan, and they had Troy and Trevelyan band. They had Banner Warren. And then probably about 2000 and something, let's say 2014, he hit the wall. The lifestyle of the music industry, his own health caught up with him. He got diagnosed with lupus, which is an autoimmune disease. So anyway, he basically went into hospital at a period of time for 3.5 months, and he died twice. He had a heart condition, had 2 strokes, 2 heart attacks. His wife had left him, and you know, it was horrific stuff. But what had happened, because he was culturally raised to be aware of his own background, where his family were from, which are from northern Queensland, even though he lived in Inala, he basically was initiated and given his name, which he'd been given when he was 14, called Jungaji. And Jungaji for him meant rock, strength, and wisdom. And Jungaji came to me after obviously knowing him for a long time, but around COVID, about 2000 and early 2002, we sat down. He said, "Mate, would you consider managing me?" I'd been managing for 1 year a Samoan beatboxer who was doing electronic dance music, and I was making a slow crawl into management. Now, just to give you an idea why I wanted to do management, it was a passion that I wanted to do back in 91, 92. I don't know why, but I felt with my business management training I could be a good manager. Problem is, in 92, I had a music store, and I'm trying to create through the industry training advisory body, South Bank TAFE, you know, as an industry supporter, and Q Music. You know, we're battling these 3 things, and I thought if I take on another thing, I'll explode.
Yep.
But I read so many books and talked to so many managers. Like all through my life, I would ring up someone like Gary Morris from Midnight Earl and say, "Oh, I hear you're living on the Coolum Coast. Can I come and have a yarn about management?" And I would sit down in front of him, you know. I would sit and talk to Jeff Chandler, who'd managing Troy Casadale, and say, "Hey, tell me about management." I was always intrigued with it, you know, like, and so by 2022, I decided I would take on Jungaji, but I said to him, "It'll take us 3 years to get your first album out, because 1, you got no money, and I have no money, so we need other people's money to get you started. And I'm not going to sell your soul to a record company. I want you to set up your own label. I want you to set up your own production company, and I want you to pay everyone." So it's taken us 3 years to get there. And there was a diversion because the old band that I used to go out and mentor, Aim for More, 30 years after I'd met them, they wanted to do a reunion. Now, Aim for More never, ever released an album. Although I do say they released a CD, and a part of that CD was written by Michael Flanders.
Yep.
And when I said, "I want to have a listen to that CD," they said, "No, we don't want you to hear it because we didn't actually write songs." So they were embarrassed. It wasn't what they wanted to be known as.
Yep.
And they were doing covers of Motown and Boys to Men, and they were actually really good at the moves and the grooves, you know.
Yeah, I think Manic or Pushworth, whatever they were booking them. I think a lot of times.
Probably, yeah.
I think Mick was working there then at the time, and yeah, I remember the buzz around him at the time. There was a lot of talk about what these boys could do.
Well, it's interesting because even Jungaji told me that they went and did and he was a very passionate and still is, obviously an NRL follower. You know, he was a young footballer. His
Mhm.
dad was in the Indigenous All Stars in the 70s that went to New Zealand, you know, in the very first NRL that went overseas, you know, as the Indigenous All Stars.
Yep.
He had a choice when he was 15, 16 to go and play rugby league or go and play basketball or music, and he chose music. You know, like all of us, we have these forks in the road. So Jungaji, he started writing, telling me. I mean, he had been writing for a few years, but he'd never recorded it. He did it. He did a few recordings with G Bass, Greg. I can never pronounce his name, but I can spell it. Greg was a great bass player that was around Vic Kenner and crew at the time. Had worked at a couple of music stores, and Greg had taken him in, and they released a couple of things on SoundCloud, and they were reasonably produced, but they didn't market it and they didn't do anything with it. They didn't release it, if you know what I mean. They just put it up. He was managed by Emily Murphy for a while. This is Troy before he became Jungaji. My role with Jungaji, he sat there at the first meeting. He said, "I don't want to be known as Troy. Troy died in hospital, and Jungaji is who I am now. I am not a drinker. I am not a smoker. I'm not a gambler." And he was all of those things and more.
Yep.
And he said, "Jungaji, I want to hold my spear strong. I want to put down the beer and I want to pick up a spear and represent my people. And I'm just an urban Murray, you know, from Gulguyalanji, which is up on Cape York. That's his family. He took me up there to meet his lawman, and we sat around the campfire. And I now appreciate and respect a lot more than I knew, although I've been gathering a lot of knowledge along the way, you know.
Yeah. But when I sort of edit this thing up a bit, I don't think I'm still trying to figure out on these things whether I can play other people's music or not. I'm not sure what the copyright things are, but
You can do a snippet.
Yeah, I'll put the vision up anyway of one of his clips, and we won't go talking too much about his life journey at the moment, because we are looking at having him on very soon with yourself again, and we'll get him to tell that story. But the new album's it's Betting on Black. That's a new album, correct? Right?
So we worked. It took us 18 months to record him. We had no money in the beginning, but I said you need to record it anyway. So slowly from gigs, he started paying the producer and studio time and the musos. And then all of a sudden we got a recording grant, you know, and that included doing some videos as well. And I thought, well, this is great, you know. So Betting on Black is his album. We released it June the 13th this year. I had an album launch at the Brisbane Powerhouse and did a show up in the Gold Coast, down the Gold Coast and up at Sunny Coast.
Yep.
He's done a couple of shows in Melbourne at the St Kilda Festival. He's been there twice now, and St Kilda Film Festival, and he's also done the Port Fairy Folk Festival. Not a lot in Sydney. You know, we've concentrated on getting this first album out, you know, 12 songs. Some of them he's been marinating for a few years.
Mm-hmm.
And finally they've taken form. And finally he's really proud. This is a body of works that he can truly say this is from him.
Absolutely, you know? and it's really good work. I mean, I'll put the link up for people to check it out on Spotify or on YouTube. Look at some of the clips. But I know some artists don't like being given comparisons, but really, when I listen to him, I hear like an Australian, bit more rock Marvin Gaye. It's got this whole Marvin Gaye feel to it, and I think, yeah, while obviously it's Indigenous artist, I often hesitate about saying Indigenous artist sometimes, because it puts a perception in people's minds that sometimes either limits them or puts it the other way. Where I just think he's a great, like in traditional terms, a great R&B artist.
And that's really, you know, when you hear the album,
very Australian sound in what he's doing, but it crosses into that real great, as I say, that Marvin Gaye type R&B feel to me anyway.
Yeah, well, those influences came out of his Aim for More days. You know, he loved Motown. He loved Boys to Men. So harmony was a big thing. And I mean, he's lucky enough to have a beautiful musical director called James Fegay Hunt, or we call him Jimmy Jam. And Jimmy's a keyboard player. Jimmy's been with him since we started this project 3 years ago. And Jimmy's added a lot to the arrangements and, the development. But, they really work up these harmonies, they really, they try stuff that even they look at each other and go, whoa, that works. And they have a great little producer, a young guy called Cody McWaters, and Cody worked on King Stingray stuff. I think he won an ARIA for some King Stingray work. But even Cody said to me, when they get in the studio and these guys push the limits, he said, God, they end up, Jimmy's got such an amazing musical sort of heritage. And he's South Sea Islander. His wife's Aboriginal. So, his family is around a lot of First Peoples as well.
Yeah.
And he's brought his brother-in-law into the band, and his young son's in the band. So it's very, very
some of the older stuff is good, but you can certainly hear the step up on this new album, and it's like it's a world standard album. I think it's really good, and so we'll do that. We'll get back to talking to him, hopefully soon.
Yes,
getting his story from him. But mate, where are you at now? I know that you've been winning some awards with it, and you've been getting some success in the charts. Where's it sitting in those areas?
Yeah, so that was the first journey for me to release an album and build a team around him. Because the key to this was I don't know everything and I don't know anything. Like, I'm truthful.
All of us, yeah.
The more I knew, the less I knew. So I hired a publicist who had been with us for about 18 months, Deborah Gann, great publicist. And, she'd come from the Polygram days, independent, and she has her way, and sometimes I'd question that and we'd try someone else as well on the team. There was a bit of resistance, but they had skills that neither Deb or I had. So we'd add other people. And then even 4 weeks out from the album, we needed a good, solid social media team. So really I had 4, myself, Deb, another guy called Perrin, and another guy called Nabil. The 4 of us were sort of the infrastructure. Then you think you've got the producer over here, and then you've got your artists, and then you've got your grant writer, and then you've got your accountant for Junga G, and you realize, holy shit, like there's nearly 10 or 15 people just supporting Junga G to get this album out.
Yeah.
You realize it's important. Like this is probably what's changed with the industry now. Before you could get a publicist, and there was a very systematic process of getting records, whether it was CD or whether it was vinyl, because let's face it, that was just a change of the physical product. But now we also put a challenge to ourselves. Could we do a vinyl release and a CD and streaming? And I went, well, why hell not? Why not? Why not try all 3? We've got nothing to lose.
Yep.
And the reason I said that is because we got the support from the funding to do those very things. And we thought, well, we've got nothing to lose. We've got everything to gain in our knowledge and experience that we will learn. But each of those 3 things are 3 separate focuses. To release a vinyl, and I just add that Suitcase Records are a Brisbane firm that started only about 18 months ago at Pinkenbar, and Suitcase Records, Kathy and Neil, amazing, because they're navigating the space too. Like in a world where the record companies don't own the pressing plants, and they've been pressing, like they pressed Troy Casadali's album. They've been pressing a lot of artists around Australia's albums, and really good quality. CD I got out of Sydney, but I tell you, just marketing those 2 are 2 separate threads of where your heads are at. And then you add digital, and I think we didn't do the digital as well as we can. We've learned what we don't know now. You know what I mean?
Did you work through a distribution company with that?
Well, you have no choice, really, as you know. You've got to go through. We went through the local Brisbane one, Gyrostream.
You mentioned the boys there.
Andy and Andy.
I'm hoping to get Andy on here soon, Andy Irvine on soon, to have a chat about what.
He's great. And I mean, look, they've been good. I mean, obviously, they represent something like 500,000 artists now. So you're just one in a pond, But I have gone into the valley and got them to help me upload some stuff because there's a lot of tricks to that digital thing that you just don't understand. And I'm trying to get my head around it, but I don't really want to be an expert.
No, that's why you have companies like that to work with. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I'd rather hire someone that really knows this shit. And it's the same with streaming. So what I'm going to say is the problem is you got vinyl CD. Let's say even if you bundle that together, distribution for that, we don't have any. So we've sold the album through Suitcase Records on their store. We've sold it through Bandcamp, and we've sold it at gigs. So what we plan to do on the week of the launch, we registered with an ARIA store so that we could register all the sales of the launch. That takes time.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how tough that actually is. So that's what a record company would be doing for an artist that the artist doesn't even realize. I learned a lot. 3 weeks out, I was tearing like all my hair. Look, I lost it through the album launch because there's so much to do in the background before you launch an album. You know, it's not just the digital space. Your head's in the digital space because you want people to know through streaming. You don't own those people in social media. You could have 10,000 followers, but only 50 people might even see your post.
Yep.
So you start spending money, and we started spending money to increase our views and try to get a call to action. But on social media, people are bombarded with so many call to action, it's easier for them just to swipe to the next thing.
Yep.
As you know, it's not easy as an independent, particularly when you don't have large databases. Where as independents, you're fighting against the three major global companies. Not only have they got the data systems worked out through their ticketing companies that most of them are invested in with the promoters, like it's a machine that knows how to reach a particular, like you say R&B. A particular promoter and record company will have a database of probably millions of people that specifically like Marvin Gaye.
Yeah, but they also know how the systems work, and this is why I think we're still all trying to figure out a lot more about the digital space. But even going back to the old retail days with the retail stores, you know, record companies would have the relationship with the stores where they might sell in, you know, 1,000 Madonna albums into that store, and that gets chalked up as 1,000 sales in that on the charts. But meanwhile, they might end up returning 700 of them. That doesn't really get noticed. So all those other things that would happen within the stores, right, things on the charts. And I'm sure the same things are happening now in the digital space. And the record companies have it mainly tied up. But it's interesting you have had some success so far.
So, and I'll tell you how that happened. If we hadn't have done the vinyl and CD, there's not a chance we would have got a number one on the Australian independent record charts.
Okay.
So AIR is a independent record label that represents, ARIA represents predominantly the major record companies, right? AIR represents all the little labels that could be independently owned by all the artists. So what happened is when we get ARIA as an auditor and we put in all our pre-sales and our sales for that week, you know, it's basically from, I think it's Thursday night to Thursday night through an ARIA store. So it's all registered, it gets audited. You have to give all the details of how many you sold, how many, whatever. Now, here's the interesting thing that I didn't know. So if you were just releasing as a streaming person, the people that listen to your music, if they're a premium Spotify, so they're paying a subscription to Spotify,
yep,
you have to get 170 listens to that one song to add to one album or CD.
Right.
So that is 1 point, let's say, towards getting a hit. So if you sell 200, let's say 100 CDs and 100 albums in those 3 days or in those 7 days, you're virtually guaranteed to have the opportunity, depending on who else is releasing that week, to get a number something within the top 10.
Yeah, right.
But it's the vinyl and CD that gets a 1 vote. Now, if some of your friends or your listeners are not premium Spotify people, the numbers are something like 900 equals 1 album. 900 listens equals 1 album. Okay.
Which I think most people would be non-premium members. I would imagine most people would.
So this is the thing. So streaming is a negative when you're in a small market like Australia. So this is why I get frustrated when I see a lot of American and UK bands coming in and European, because they already have the advantage of larger populations that they can build their audiences on, and then they
Yep.
can take it to the world because people go, oh, look at
So,
their digital metrics, and oh, they sell a lot of albums and CDs, but it's all constructed to get them chart listings, because obviously when you get a chart listing, people sort of pay attention to
yeah,
what you're doing. Now
yeah.
we also got I think it was four ARIA listings too in four different charts.
Hmm.
We got a number 2, a number 6, a number 19, a number 8 or something, for R&B, for independent. Another one was just for the album itself. And I thought, my God, now I know what I know for the second album,
Yep.
which will be out at some period later next year. Um, we know what we have to do. We have to build teams. You need a lot of people to help you drive the numbers.
But just on those sales that move the charts, the album and the CDs, are they like physical through a shop, or is it also the shop's online store?
All of that.
Right.
So if you can do it online and you can do it in store, what we didn't put any in store. I don't know why. Don't even ask. I mean, that's a failure on our point. We
Yeah,
should have also gone out and put it in stores,
and done promo there.
which would have added, and promoted it there as well.
Have a
So,
launch day there.
and there lies the challenge, right? You've actually got so many balls in the air
Yeah,
leading up to the launch. And even with the team, and really we were doing all the heavy lifting, for Jungaji. As an artist, he's got a team trying to position him in all of this. If you're an artist doing it on your own, Nick, that's tough. Because
absolutely.
Jungaji's head needed to be in the shows and doing interviews and thinking about the next album. I mean, his head's already, that's the album I've already given birth to.
Yep.
I'm now thinking, well, we've got to have something else. Now, the good news is we've got an EP about to drop, but we've got 6 videos and 6 audio songs. We'll call it an EP. It's called Jungaji, the Acoustic Sessions.
Oh, cool.
So we're about to drop that, but not at the moment. I was going to do it last week, but we had a delay and a glitch, in the way we were going to market it. And we just said, pause, stop, let's regroup, and we'll release it in 4 weeks' time.
All right, mate. Well, let me know when you're about to do that, and I'll make sure that we get letting my friends know through this little thing I'm doing.
Yep.
But mate, it's been really interesting chatting about the one thing's funny too, even though there's these new ways to figure out how it happens. I was talking to had Barry Bull on the other week, and we're talking about when he would have like a lot of those big famous artists turn up to Toombul Music and do those appearances, and quite a few of them they'd go there because the record company would kind of pretty much tell them to, but they'll be like, we don't really want to be here in a shopping center talking like they just didn't get it until Barry would point out to them, well, we're going to shift 500-600 sales today here, and that's going to get you move your position up the chart a long way. And the same principle held back in the 90s and the 80s as held today. It's just a different environment that we're operating in. We're trying to figure out how those things work. And mate, what you've spoken about there today has been great advice, mate. And it's great to see that the challenges you're facing, but also the solutions you're uncovering.
Well, one of the things I learned the other day, I was talking to just another independent artist, and she said, have you thought about next time having a special night for your super fans? So the one thing is, in this day and age, this is what the record companies do understand. There are super fans, there are fans, and there are just people that may come across you and follow you for a short time. But these super fans are the ones that sell you to other people. They're like they're the invisible influencers. So when you identify who they are, and they're identified because you can find them on social media because they'll always be watching your stuff. You know, you can find them at a grassroots level. They're there, they come to all the shows, they're always singing the songs. They're the ones mimic the lyrics in the front row. And you're thinking, there's my super fans right there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And Jungaji is aware of that because I've talked to him about it. Go up, talk to those people, hug them. You know what I mean? Thank them for being there.
Absolutely, and they are the people that drive you along. Whether you're sort of doing local gigging through to putting albums out, it's those people who are there all the time, and it's awkward sometimes because people do like to feel connected to you, like they're a part of what you're doing and everything else. And there is that thin line sometimes where you have to be like an artist and have that little bit of a distance, but at the same time, you really want to thank those people and encourage them for what they do. Because it can become a big part of their life. Mate, I would like to get you on this quite regularly if we could, to chat about different things. I mean, there's a million things we could expand on here today, going back to, as you and I often talk about our music industry from representation point of view and the government and Q Music and everything else. There's more we could talk about there. There's more we can talk about, celebrating people that we've worked with in the past, like the Shories of the world. I'm hoping to get Greg on very shortly as well to talk about his thing. And of course, mate, looking forward to Jungaji coming on. But mate, we've been chatting for over an hour here today. And have you got anything else you would like to particularly bring up?
The only thing that the biggest learning curve I'm on right now is how to build an audience. You know, how to build Jungaji's audience, because all the time he's been in the industry, which is 32 years, you know, he's got a lot of people that know who he is and, you know, come to shows and all that sort of thing. But the real proof in the pudding of where loyalty of building an audience is, where they'll put money in their pocket, pull it out and buy a ticket and support a live show. Or they'll put their money out and they'll buy the vinyl at $55 or the CD at $20 and actually, or the $40 t-shirt. Now, the reason I say that is I work on these big shows, right? Now, these are artists that you and I have not heard of. I just did the Merry Wallopers the other night as an example, right, at the Princess Theatre. They're from Ireland. They're an Irish, modern, contemporary Irish band. The place was packed, right? Yeah. I did another show just the other day at the Fortitude Valley Music Hall with a band that I've never heard of before. And they were quite huge because there were 3,000 people in there who've all paid $189 a ticket, and the merchandise was sold there. And through our little network, we were told they sold over $100,000 worth of merchandise. And my jaw just drops because I go, now I'm not saying we need to sell $100,000 worth of merch at every gig, but man, if you could sell $1,000 worth of merch at every gig, and you've got people buying tickets to your show, because they come there, venues will want you. You'll be more or less saying to venues, well, I'm not sure if I want to go to your venue. Exactly. Because you've got to turn off your TV because I don't have people sitting there watching TV and a football game behind me. They're there to be attentive. Jungaji has said to me, I never want to do a show when no one's listening to me. So I've made sure that every time he gets asked to do a gig, even if it's a small gig, are the people there to network and talk and whatever, or are they there to listen to him? And they go, oh, we really just need his background. Okay, sorry, stop you there. That's not who he is, and that's not the story he's going to tell you, you know?
Good job, manager.
Well, you know, that's it. You're a gatekeeper to what the artist really wants you to be represented in, you know?
It's funny, even at those smaller gigs, perception is everything. If people walk in and see an artist playing and there's no one really listening and telly's on and they're stuck in the corner, you're not going to get people to stay or anything because, well, the venue's not respecting them, so they mustn't be very good. That's the thought process. Whereas if you walk in and things look like they should be there is, set up the right way and the artist is actually allowed to perform to the best of their level, well, it changes the whole game. Yep. So, mate, totally agree with you on all that, mate. But, mate, thank you for this, and I hope you'll come back and do many more chats, but we will get Jungaji back up as soon as he's into it. I know he's had a busy time with travelling and in the studio and everything, so we'll catch up with him soon.
You will. You will, mate, definitely.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Greg Dodge. Cheers, buddy.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, buddy.